Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. This is episode 11, Meta Grammar. It is not cosmology. It is not a physics derivation. It is the discipline that governs how rules are discovered, tested, licensed, narrowed, downgraded, archived, or retired, so science remains sane. Part 48 is called Scale Stability. The core question is simple. Does a rule survive when we zoom in or zoom out? To make this feel real, hold an everyday scene in your mind. Imagine you are walking through a busy market on a Saturday. If you stand close to the stalls, you see tiny details. The way a merchant folds cloth, the way spices pour like sand, the way a child tugs a parent's sleeve. But if you go up to a roof and look down, those details melt into bigger patterns. A river of people, clusters forming around popular stalls, empty corridors opening and closing like breathing lanes. Same market, same reality, different zoom. Now here is the crucial question. If you describe the market from the street and you describe it from the roof, do your descriptions contradict each other or do they connect? Can you translate between them? Scale stability is exactly that question, but for scientific rules. It asks, when we change the magnification of observation, do we keep seeing the same law wearing different clothes? Or do we discover that the law was only a trick of the lens? And this matters more than most people realize, because many of the most dangerous mistakes in science are not lies. They are illusions that look lawful at one scale and collapse at another. The signature axiom of this episode is the spine of our method. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. And when a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. That is the firewall. Now let us build scale stability inside your intuition, like a tool you can actually use. Scale stability, in plain language, means this. The rule remains valid under coarse-graining and refinement. Coarse-graining means you average details into a larger, simpler description. Refinement means you increase detail and look closer. A scale-stable rule may change its surface form when you change resolution, but it remains the same constraint class. That means, once you translate properly between zoom levels, it keeps making compatible predictions. A scale-fragile rule is different. It fits beautifully at one zoom level, and then it breaks when you zoom. It evaporates, reverses, or demands endless patches. It is like a rumor that sounds convincing until you check one more detail. Here is a simple picture, a city map. If you zoom out, you see big roads and districts. If you zoom in, you see side streets, alleyways, doors, and staircases. A good map is scale stable. The main roads you saw when zoomed out are still there when you zoom in. You just discover extra detail. A bad map is scale fragile. The road you thought existed disappears when you zoom in because it was only a blur. Scale stability asks whether our scientific map behaves like the good map, not the bad one. Now, why is this necessary? What failure does it prevent? Scale fragility creates a confidence trap. You can discover a rule at one resolution and feel certain, because at that resolution your data, instrument, and analysis pipeline line up neatly. The fit looks clean and the residual looks small. You feel the pleasure of, I found it. But then you zoom in and the rule evaporates. Or you zoom out and the rule reverses. Or you discover the rule only holds after a very specific smoothing filter. Or you need ad hoc terms that were never stated in the original claim. If you're not disciplined, you start protecting the rule instead of testing it. That is how mythology enters science. Not through intentional deception, but through rules never tested against scale change. Think about a phone photograph. From far away, a cluster of pixels can look like a face. Up close, it is noise. Or a crack in a wall can look straight from a distance, but up close, it is jagged and branching. Scale stability protects us from taking the faraway illusion and calling it law. Now we translate this into holophase language. In holophase, we do not speak in metaphor alone. We anchor everything to phi and its dimensional shadows. We begin with phi, the holophase field. We speak of phi as a function of position x and time t. Phi of x, t. From phi, we read the triunity. Time. Omega equals d phi over dt. Omega is the rate of change of phi with respect to time. Space. Kappa equals d phi over dx. Kappa is the rate of change of phi with respect to space. Motion. Nu equals omega divided by kappa. Nu is the motion readout linking time rhythm and spatial structure. In holophase, scaling is never only space. When you zoom, you change what counts as a unit of time, what counts as a unit of space, and what effective motion you can resolve. So scale change shifts all three echoes at once, omega, kappa, and nu together. Make that feel concrete. Imagine filming a hummingbird with a normal camera. At normal speed, the wings are a blur. Film the same hummingbird with a high-speed camera, and you see wing strokes and rebounds. You did not change the bird, you changed your time resolution. That is an omega shift. But when omega changes, kappa is pulled with it, because what you can resolve in space depends on how motion smears across your sensor over time. Motion blur, sampling, and spatial resolution are married. That is a kappa shift. And when omega and kappa shift, nu shifts too, because nu is read from the relationship between omega and kappa. So zoom is a tri-unity transformation. This is why part 48 is not a side topic. If your rule is supposed to be a constraint on phi, it must remain coherent when omega kappa nu resolution changes. Now, how does scale change appear operationally in real measurement? In practice, scale change shows up as changes in resolution and aggregation. Refinement means you collect data with finer spacing, shorter time steps, higher bandwidth instruments, better sampling, or better signal to noise. Coarse-graining means you average, integrate, or compress data. Many small events become one larger summary. The key operational rule: when you change scale, you must specify the translation you used. Otherwise, you are comparing different languages and calling it contradiction. In daily life, this is like currency. If someone says this costs 10, you have not learned anything until you know the currency. Scale change is a currency change for omega, kappa, and nugu. You must state the conversion. Now, what does the firewall block here? Two disasters. Disaster 1. Promoting a rule that is only a measurement artifact. Artifacts often live at one resolution: a sensor's pixel grid, a smoothing kernel, a sampling rate, a numerical approximation, a fitting choice. These can create patterns that look real but vanish when you change scale. Disaster 2. Multiplying ad hoc terms to rescue a fragile rule. If every time you change scale, you must add a new patch, a new coefficient, a new correction, and none of these were licensed as part of the same constraint class, you are not discovering constraints on phi. You are building a protective story around the favorite equation. The firewall forbids that. Now I want you to remember another story. Imagine a carpenter building a staircase in an old house. At the core scale, the plan is simple. Every step rises by the same height. But when the carpenter measures closely, he discovers the floor is uneven and the walls are not perfectly straight. Some steps need tiny adjustments. A good staircase rule is scale stable. Each step rises by the same amount, remains the constraint, but the measurements are translated by the baseline. A bad staircase rule would be the rise must be identical to the millimeter no matter what, which forces the carpenter to fight reality and can produce a dangerous staircase. Scale stability is not about denying detail. It is about discovering constraints that remain meaningful when detail changes. Before we move on, let me show you how scale stability feels when you are the one making decisions. Imagine you are driving at night in heavy fog. At a distance, the headlights of another car look like one bright spot. You might think it is a motorcycle coming toward you. But as it approaches, the single spot separates into two lights, and you realize it is a full car. Nothing in the world changed. Only the scale of what you could resolve changed. If you built a rule about traffic based on the faraway view, vehicles have one light, you would be wrong. Not because you were foolish, but because your view was limited. Science has the same fog. Instruments are headlights. Data pipelines are the windshield. When we claim a rule, we must ask, is this rule describing the world or describing the fog? In Holophase terms, fog is anything that limits your licensed window. Noise, bandwidth, sampling, smoothing, clipping, compression. Fog hides fast omega changes, blurs sharp kappa structures, and therefore distorts inferred nu. The firewall is the habit of never forgetting the fog. Now consider a different everyday scene, listening to music through a wall. From far away, you hear only the beat. Boom, boom, boom. That is coarse scale. If you move closer, you start hearing the melody and the words. That is refinement. If your rule about the song is only, it is a drum, that rule is not wrong at the coarse scale, but it is incomplete. A scale-stable description would say, the beat is the coarse shadow of the full song. When you refine, the description expands without contradiction. A scale-fragile description would insist there is only a drum, even when you can clearly hear the violin and the singer. This is also why scale stability is a filter for civilization. Whole communities can build institutions around a rule that was only true in the through-the-wall regime, and then resist the moment when closer listening reveals more structure. Metagrammar trains you to love the closer listening, not fear it. Now, one more practical technique, the two-zoom confession. Whenever you present a rule, force yourself to say two sentences. At this scale, I claim the rule looks like this. At a different scale, after this translation, I expect it to look like that. If you cannot say the second sentence, you are not ready to license the rule as scale stable. You may still use it locally, but you must label it honestly as scale bound. Finally, remember, scale stability is not a demand that the world be simple. It is a demand that our claims be disciplined. The world can be richly layered. Our task is to make sure our rules survive honest zooming. And when it survives, the license widens. When it fails, the label tightens, and knowledge becomes cleaner for everyone today. Now let us build the simplest scale stability test as a clean protocol you can repeat. Step 1. Choose a candidate rule family. Call it G. Step 2. Apply G at a fine resolution. Call this scale S-fine. You infer the rule within your licensed window and uncertainty discipline. Step 3. Coarse-grain the fine data into a coarse description. Call this scale S-coarse. Step 4. Infer what G predicts at the coarse scale using a translation rule, not by refitting freely. If you allow unlimited refitting at every scale, you can make almost anything look stable. The test is not can I refit. The test is can I translate. Step 5. Compare the predicted course behavior with the observed course behavior. Step 6. Reverse direction. Take the course rule, refine it back down using the translation, and compare with the fine observations. If the rule is scale stable, both directions remain compatible within uncertainty. If the rule is scale fragile, one direction fails. It collapses, reverses, or demands new unlicensed terms. Now we anchor this with one spoken equation. We write phi s of x, t. Phi at scale s of position x and time t. This means we do not claim we see the full phi directly. We see phi filtered through a scale window. We define coarse-graining as an averaging operator. Phi coarse equals C applied to phi fine. C is simply the declared rule for how you blur details into a larger picture. Averaging, filtering, integrating, summarizing. Scale stability demands that the rule family commutes with coarse-graining. In audio, apply the rule, then coarse-grain should match coarse-grain, then apply the rule, within uncertainty. That is the heart of it. Now we bring back triunity under scaling. When you refine, you can see faster variations in time, so omega can reveal higher components. When you coarse-grain, you average rapid fluctuations, so omega becomes an effective slower rhythm. When you refine, you resolve sharper spatial features, so kappa can show steeper gradients. When you coarse-grain, you smooth sharp features, so kappa becomes an effective gentler structure. And because nu equals omega divided by kappa, motion descriptions renormalize. They change in a controlled, lawful way. Daily analogy: walking versus traffic. At the scale of one person, motion is footstep-like. Stop, step, stop, step. At the scale of a city, motion looks like a continuous river of cars. These are different new descriptions, but they belong to the same constraint class if the translation is disciplined. Now we enforce one of the deepest holophase disciplines. Energy is not a primitive deity. Energy is accounting. It is tally, a ledger readout that summarizes how phi is behaving in a licensed window. So under scaling, the ledger must renormalize cleanly. We can say a simple ledger sentence. E total equals E1 plus E2 plus En plus R. E total is the total tally under the licensed window. E1 through En are the component tallies your rule claims to account for. R is the residual mismatch, what you could not explain. Under scaling, a stable rule makes the tallies translate. Coins become bills, bills become transfers, but the balance stays coherent. A scale fragile rule makes the ledger meaningless and the residual R explodes. So the ledger test is practical. Under your translation between scales, does the residual remain bounded within uncertainty or does it blow up? Now I will state the prediction of part 48 in one sentence. Prediction. If a rule is scale stable, then measurements at different resolutions will produce compatible omega kappa nu predictions after appropriate coarse graining and refinement. Plain language: if you zoom in and zoom out honestly, you will not get a different world. You will get the same constraint expressed in different resolution language. Now I will state the falsification condition. Falsification. If changing resolution causes the rule to collapse, predictions reverse, or the rule requires ad hoc new terms not licensed as part of the same constraint class, then the rule is not scale stable. It must be labeled scale bound or downgraded to a local artifact. Now we talk about consequences, because the firewall is governance. If the rule passes scale stability, the firewall strengthens its license. It earns broader scope labels across more omega regimes, more kappa samplings, and more new contexts because it has proven stability under scaling. If the rule fails, the firewall relabels it. It becomes explicitly scale-bound. You may still use it where it works, but you may not export it as fundamental-like. And if it repeatedly fails, it may be archived as a resolution artifact. Now let us bring everyday examples, because examples are how your brain learns, surface form versus constraint class. Example 1, cooking. A scale-stable cooking rule survives when you cook for 1 person or for 10 people, once you translate properly. Salt to taste can be scale-stable if taste is a feedback rule. Add a little, taste, adjust. But 1 spoon of salt is scale-bound. It might work for 1 pot and fail for another. Example 2, reading. A child focuses on letters, that is fine scale. An adult reads words, not letters. That is coarse scale. Reading is scale stable. The letters still exist, but the constraints change form. Meaning persists because translation is lawful. Example 3, training. At the fine scale, muscles are fibers contracting. At the coarse scale, you feel, I can lift this. A scale-stable principle is progressive overload, gradually increased challenge. A scale-fragile principle is do exactly 12 repetitions forever. Now we add a hidden trick. Same data is not always same question. A listener might think, if I use the same dataset, I'm being fair. But scale change can be unfair even on the same dataset, because changing scale changes the question you ask. When you smooth, you ask for trend. When you refine, you ask for detail. Trend and detail can both be real, but they are not the same object. Daily analogy. Listening to a person. If you listen to someone for 1 sentence, you might decide they are angry. If you listen for 1 hour, you might decide they are stressed. If you listen for 1 year, you might decide they are gentle but under pressure. Nothing contradictory happened. You changed the time window. So scale stability is not demanding one frozen description. It is demanding compatibility once you admit what question was asked. Zooming changes the units of reality you can resolve. At coarse scale, your clock tick is large. Many tiny events happen inside 1 tick. At fine scale, your clock tick is small. Events separate. At coarse scale, a ruler mark is thick. Many features fit inside 1 mark. At fine scale, the mark is thin. Features separate. That is why the firewall insists. Scaling shifts omega, kappa, and nu together. If you change the clock tick, omega changes because omega is change per time. If you change the ruler mark, kappa changes because kappa is change per space. And if omega and kappa change, nu changes because nu is omega divided by kappa. Now we speak about licensed windows under scaling, because Holophase is always operational. A license is permission with boundaries. Under scaling, the license must state what transformations are allowed. Allowed. You may coarse-grain by averaging in a way that preserves instrument support. You may refine by increasing resolution when the instrument and sampling support it. You may translate between scales with declared operators like C, carrying uncertainty through the translation. Forbidden. You may not invent fine detail the data cannot support. You may not claim stability when coarse-graining erased the features that would test the rule. You may not hide that your translation operator changed. Daily analogy. Zooming a low-resolution phone photo. Zooming in does not create real detail. It creates blocky squares. That is fake refinement. Science can do the same. A pipeline can hallucinate structure when it pushes beyond instrument support. Now we clarify constraint class versus surface form, because the phrase can sound like an excuse if you are not careful. When we say it changes form but stays the same class, we are not escaping falsification. We are being precise. Think of water. At molecular scale, water is collisions. At kitchen scale, water is a fluid you pour. At weather scale, water is clouds and storms. Different forms, but the constraint class remains. Once you translate, stable relations still hold. So, constraint class means the rule's identity is not tied to one exact equation written in one coordinate system at one resolution. Its identity is tied to invariance, what remains true under translation. In Holophase terms, a constraint class is a family of admissible phi patterns whose omega kappa nu relationships remain coherent under licensed scaling. You can think of it like the same melody played by different instruments. The sound changes, but the relative relationships persist, so the melody remains recognizable. Now a final nuance. Effective parameters are allowed, but only with a translation law. A scale-stable rule may use different effective parameters at different zoom levels. That is normal if the change is lawful. If the coarse parameter is computed from the fine parameter by declared translation, stability remains. If the parameter must be tuned by hand each time, the rule is scale fragile. And now we name the three most common birthplaces of scale artifacts. First, sampling artifacts. If your sampling rate is too low, fast oscillations can alias into slow ones. Sample faster, and the pattern disappears. That was not phi, it was sampling. Second, smoothing artifacts. A smoothing kernel can create apparent laws by erasing counterexamples. Blur a jagged line, and it looks linear. Refine, and the law dies. Third, discretization artifacts. A grid can imprint its own geometry on the data. Patterns align with pixel edges, not with phi. Change the grid, and the pattern changes. Scale stability testing is how we catch these early. Now I will give you one strong crowd example, because it captures the soul of the topic. Picture a stadium emptying after a match. At fine scale, each person makes stop-start decisions, turns, hesitates, and avoids collisions. At coarse scale, the crowd behaves like a fluid. Lanes form, bottlenecks appear, waves of motion propagate. A scale-stable rule says, if you average properly, you can predict the flow patterns from individual behaviors. And if you zoom in, the flow dissolves into steps without contradiction. A scale-fragile rule would be, the crowd is literally a smooth fluid at all scales. That would wrongly predict that an individual never stops. This shows why new changes with scale. Individual new looks like footsteps. Crowd new looks like effective flow. Scale stability is not forcing one description everywhere. It is demanding the bridge between them. Now here is a quick zoom test checklist you can use whenever you hear a claim. Ask, what is the finest scale where the data truly supports it? What is the coarsest scale where it is still meaningful? What is the declared translation rule between those scales? After translation, do the omega kappa nu predictions match within declared uncertainty? If these answers do not exist, the claim is not yet licensed as scale stable. And now we return to phi one last time, because the deepest meaning of scale stability is humility. Peace be upon you.